For this edition of Now Age Conversations, I'm speaking with journalist Ruth Whippman. Hey, Ruth.
Hi.
Hey, thanks for being here. Ruth recently wrote a book called, I guess in the UK, it's called The Pursuit of Happiness. The interesting part, the version coming out in the US is called America the Anxious.
That's
And
right.
I think maybe it's a good introduction. You can kind of talk about as being someone who's British coming over here and seeing these distinctions between the sort of awareness of happiness as a Brit and what happens when you come to America and see the sort of anxious state of happiness here.
Right. So you want me to talk a bit about that? Yeah, sure. So, we moved to California, which is probably like the real nerve center of this type of thing. Came from England. And, it was pretty obvious from quite soon after moving here that this one topic just kept on coming up again and again and again. And this was the idea of happiness, how people could become happier and all the things that people were doing to make themselves happier. So, there was, at the time, that was the one thing that was very big was mindfulness, mindfulness workshops and practices and, positive thinking, yoga, self-help, different types of seminars, different types of religious or semi-religious things that people were doing. And it was all this kind of huge effort that people put into the idea of becoming happier. And, I'm a kind of, I think the British way is slightly more cynical, a little bit more skeptical. And, I would sort of think to myself, wow, this really feels like quite a lot of hard work, for something that's supposed to be, fun and pleasurable and, to make people feel joy. It seemed like it was almost a real anxiety around the topic of happiness. So, as a journalist, I wanted to look into it a little bit more. And, I started digging around and I found that there is a huge multi-billion-dollar happiness industry in this country, and also, in the UK as well. But I think here in America, it's where it's probably at its most valuable and and its most popular. And there's this huge, as I say, huge multi-million-dollar industry devoted to making people, to getting people happy. But yet, when you look at the statistics and the research, the kind of country comparisons. Actually, America is like one of the least happy countries in the developed world. So, by rights, considering how much money and time and emotional energy people are spending on becoming happier, people in America should be the happiest people on the planet. But really, in reality, they're actually one of the least happy. And there was one study that came out recently that had America placed 2 ranks behind Rwanda in terms of contentment. When you think about that, here's a country that's had this major psychological and actual collective trauma, but yet they're coming out as happier than people in the the richest and best provided for country on earth.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've lived in America all my life, so I've kind of been steeped in this, what the expectation of happiness is, the materialistic nature of American society, the individual competitive nature of American society, none of which really brings happiness because it all just, the notion of winning in a competitive society means you're alone as the winner, but there's no community in being the winner because second place is first loser, and that's the American sort of notion. You get into in your book the positive psychology movement. You talked a little bit about Barbara Ehrenreich wrote about Brightside a couple of years ago, which I'm sure you kind of looked at, and I kind of like that you're getting into this because it really caught my eye. Your piece you wrote in The Guardian about this, because I've been writing about this as well. And frustratingly, over the years, like the movie The Secret, for instance, the book and film, which, seemed to me just to be such, glorifying magical thinking, telling people, things that you would tell, young children in preschool and kindergarten about, the sky is always blue and the sun rises and, and all these nice, happy songs. But this is for adults who just can't be able to face the reality of what their life is. So then we have, Tony Robbins, we have Eston Landmark. Of course, you mentioned mindfulness, gratitude, and it all just seems to kind of play into this magical thinking that people seem to need to hook onto because maybe they can't live with the reality of what it is.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned The Secret. The Secret is a great example because The Secret is one of the best-selling books ever written in any category or any genre. So more people have bought that book than pretty much any book on earth. It's up there in the top 10.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is magical thinking. The whole thing is quite preposterous. The idea that there's this law of attraction, which is kind of a law of physics, that somehow if you think positive, positive things will happen to you. And absolutely, I agree with you that it's selling people a fantasy, but I don't even think that's necessarily the worst part about it. I mean, people like fantasies, and throughout the ages, people have enjoyed stories and hope and all of those sorts of things. But I think the problem with these types of books, and The Secret is probably a particularly sinister example of it, is that this idea that, if happiness comes from thinking positively, and if, in order to be happy and to attract good things in your life, your thoughts need to attract them. So you need to be thinking the right thoughts. It can very easily kind of morph into a kind of victim blaming, where it's this idea that, it's all down to you as the individual to think the right thoughts. And none of it is down to society to actually provide the right conditions for people to be happy. And I think that's a very American idea in and of itself. It's this idea of a meritocracy, the American dream, and that if you only work hard enough at something, then you will be rewarded. And when you apply that to the emotions, I think that's a very, very difficult place for people, because it doesn't take into account the fact that we're not all starting from the same point. People's circumstances do matter. And I think especially, you mentioned the positive psychology movement. That has, the secret is kind of, lots of people can kind of look down on that as being, a mass market thing. But the positive psychology movement gives these ideas a real kind of academic respectability. There's a positive psychology movement all across the Ivy League, in Harvard, at, the University of Pennsylvania, at, highly recommended, highly respected academic institutions, are teaching something which is not a million miles away from The Secret. There's a lot of research going into this positive psychology movement, which is funded by very right-wing billionaire interests who are very intent on pushing this message that happiness is all about individual effort. And it's a kind of neoliberal idea that, I think is really quite damaging for people.
Right. Well, that was the part that really got me, because I've been really focused on this sort of neoliberal aspect of it, that it lets the greater society off the hook. In this part that you wrote in your book, when you said, ever since I first dipped my toe into the world of the consumer happiness industry, I have struggled with this basic narrative, with its almost belligerent denial that structural obstacles to happiness exist. It seems to promote a dangerous level of social and political disengagement about tackling the injustices of the wider world. And that is exactly what I've been kind of, trying to stab at for a while as well, is that it does give cover to the neoliberal establishment.
Absolutely. It really promotes this idea that, if happiness is about the individual, if well-being is purely a question of individual effort, then it completely lets governments and society off the hook for providing any kinds of services, a welfare state, a social safety net, any measures to get people out of poverty or to increase general living standards. Because, if everyone has an equal shot at happiness just by thinking happy thoughts or, being more positive, really, it's kind of saying if you're not happy, it's your own fault. It's nothing to do with us. And you already see this, like in the UK government where I'm from. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, is highly influenced by positive psychology. He started up a kind of happiness index in British society, which, they kind of measure the happiness of the British people. And then the idea was that they would use this to influence policy. But at the same time as, making all this noise about making everybody happier, he stripped back the welfare state to the point where, people had been plunged into poverty. Services for mental health and for all kinds of things, for housing, for all the things that improve the conditions of people's lives have been removed. So, A, it's hypocritical, and B, it's part of this narrative that, why do we care if we're stripping back all of these services? Because being happy is really just your own, your own issue, your own responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, I started calling it New Age libertarianism.
Yeah.
And you can see it now in not just the Tony Robbins, but the Tony Robbins acolytes, like, Oprah and Arianna Huffington. These people have also now walked in this mold of saying, just emulate me. And it's all about the glorification of the individual. And,
yes.
and we all have this innate sense, this because we're Americans, and the notion of American exceptionalism I wrote about a couple of weeks ago, that, that that spreads to a lot of things. So it gives us justification in the world to do all kinds of things under colonialism, militarism. But we say, we're exceptional because we're doing it in the name of good. And so American exceptionalism has meant a lot of different things. But it kind of came to me recently. In fact, there's a writer and an intellectual named Rabbi Michael Lerner, who's pretty vocal voice on the left. And he he wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Left Hand of God. And he did his dissertation work, his PhD, on figuring out why people were innately unhappy in the workplace. And it was a pretty deep study. And what they found was there was this existential, the sort of subjugation of one has to make of themselves to the marketplace. Happens in America more so than in any other place. In other words, the selling of the soul, so to speak. For the dollar, we have to. To me, the American exceptionalism is that we get to prostitute ourselves to the marketplace, and the marketplace tells us what we're worth, and that everybody else is evaluating us by those same standards. And what has to be tossed aside are all the parts of us that we consider valuable, because they probably aren't valuable in the marketplace. And that's the part where I don't see how one can find happiness within a system that works that way.
Absolutely, and I think especially in American culture, there's this huge thing about working incredibly long hours, and because there's very little in the way of a social safety net and regulation on this, there's no federal maternity leave, say, there's no federal mandated vacation time for work. These punishingly long hours in the corporate world. And now, companies, going back to the happiness thing, companies are instituting all these kind of happiness training and mindfulness seminars and all the rest of it in the workplace. It's almost as though there's this kind of real blurring of the lines between work and self, work and leisure, and, kind of company-enforced socializing. And, in the book, I go and visit some of these Silicon Valley companies where they'll have, a meditation guru and a pinball table and, free food everywhere and a doctor and a dentist and a hairdresser and a cook and all the rest of it in the workplace. And the idea is that, all of these things are great, but it means that you never, ever go home. People don't have genuine leisure time. And you're absolutely right. You call it subjugated to the marketplace, and that's exactly what's happening. We are, in this country are becoming our working lives. And that's blurred with ourselves. And I think that's very, very problematic. And actually, all these, it's kind of ironic because at the same time companies are providing happiness gurus, they're actually stripping back a lot of the genuine rights that people have in the workplace. Unionization is a huge thing where, unionized workers are happier than non-unionized workers. And, people, unionized workers have better actual benefits and pay. But yet, of course, these companies don't want people to join unions or anything that will give them real material gains. Is this idea that it's cheaper to hire a happiness trainer than it is to give people a pay rise or, medical benefits or sick leave or whatever.
So the question then becomes, how does this happen in America? What's so different about the way we live compared to the rest of the world? We talk about Rwanda, where I haven't been to Rwanda, but I'll take it on, on a best guess, that they don't have what we have materially and technologically and sort of even freedoms that we have in America, quote unquote freedoms. Yeah. But my sense is what they don't have is that they are not, the holy grail in those societies is not the television, right? Here in America, television speaks to the individual and to the collective in a way that it homogenizes thought. We forget about what it is to live in community and to know our neighbors and to talk about our shared issues, our problems, and what have you. And, what happens is we see these fake lives of people, and of celebrities, of course, living these fabulous lives. And then we're just left to think that, okay, we'll work hard one day and we'll too be American Idol or we'll be whatever that will be. That's the next step for all Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't speak to the point about Rwanda because, I've never been there and I don't know much about it as a society, but I think American society is, exactly as you say, a very individualistic society. It's based on the idea that, that we rise up to the top, that we work harder and harder and we rise to the top, and that the individual is everything and the community is just what we kind of gather along the way. There's some interesting data. If you look at time use surveys where they actually, see how people spend their time in America, we spend around 30 minutes a day on the category of socializing and communicating. So that includes not just good socializing and communicating, but all socializing and communicating that involves more than one adult. So all the kind of nagging and bitching and arguing, as well as all the good stuff. And 30 minutes a day, that means we spend 23 and a half hours of the day doing something completely different. But yet we know from research that communicating and community are the single biggest things that bring us happiness and well-being, but we don't do much of it. And absolutely, and I think this whole idea of, and it's as you say, the kind of the new age, the inner journey, this idea that happiness is a result of a kind of inner journey. You go deep inside yourself and really explore your soul and yourself. When actually, that's not the way happiness works at all. Happiness is about community. It's about taking responsibility for other people as well as yourself. And actually, happiness does not really come from within. It kind of comes from without. But yet we're so attached to this idea that if you want to be happy, you need to kind of go deep down inside yourself.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the problems is that, when we talk about is it being covered for the neoliberal economy, is that it comes down to it's capitalism. And everything about, I'm convinced there's no way to do capitalism that also provides for happiness. Like they just don't seem consistent. You can only put so many restrictions on the capitalist system that doesn't either exploit people and resources to the point that they're exploited, that I don't know where happiness can fit in at that point. And I think that's where everything plays in. The media that divides us, so we don't have that quality time with each other. We just have time with some television host or some television program. And I've been saying for years, I have this fantasy that, we live without television, but if people would get up in the morning and go to switch on their set and no signal came out, and they would try to figure out why there was no signal and call the cable company, check, and then they would go check their neighbor, and their neighbor also is outside, their signal isn't working, and they just met their neighbor for the first time and started talking and actually sharing for the first time. To me, the greatest impediment is how the media has been used as a sort of cudgel for really dividing people and keeping people isolated in their own thoughts.
Interesting. One of the most ironic examples I saw of that was, I don't know if you've seen, you can get for your smartphone a happiness app where you stare at your phone and it will text you pictures of your loved ones that will scroll through with this kind of picture montage and all this, and all these, lovely music and all the rest of it, and you're kind of staring at your phone, scrolling through to see pictures of your own loved ones. Meanwhile, your actual loved ones are doing their own thing and probably staring at their own happiness apps on their phones to look at pictures of you. You think, gosh, this really is if that's the way that we're finding happiness, is to look at your happiness app on your cell phone. And I remember when we first moved here, I actually downloaded one of these happiness apps, and it wasn't one with pictures, it was one that would text you kind of positive messages throughout the day. And, every hour or so it would send you a message which would say, I am enough, or I am beautiful, or whatever, and you're supposed to kind of really repeat it and internalize it. And I remember there was, but the problem was that, my phone would buzz and I think, great, someone's sending me a text. I've got a friend, maybe they want to go out and do something. And I'd look and it would be this wretched happiness app and, texting me to say, I am enough. And I think, I just want to throw the thing across the room because that's not, so I deleted it anyway.
Yeah, well, I've noticed the same thing happen on my social media feed for years now. And maybe I have more kind of friends sort of in the new agey, crunchy community maybe than you do. And a friend of mine had been posting 100 Days of Happiness. So every day there will be another happy slogan. So I must have some sort of British sensibility because my response to that was 100 Days of Grumpy. And every day I would just post this, why I'm grumpy. And I said, it makes me so happy to talk about why I'm grumpy. And some people thought it was kind of funny. But, it actually did make me happy to talk about why I was grumpy because and that was the truth. It actually made me feel better to kind of, as my grandmother would say in Yiddish, you would kvetch a little bit. And, you do that and you'd feel better.
Right. And you share the realities of life. I think that's one of the real problems of social media because we've kind of developed this collective language where social media and Facebook is all about, showing the world how happy you are and, editing out the parts where you maybe feel ambivalent or pissed off or annoyed or whatever. And, And I think it was interesting because when we first moved here, I always used to say, I could tell, you could blindfold me and tell me which, they read out the Facebook statuses of my friends, and I could tell you which ones were American and which ones were British, because the American ones would be like, I'm feeling so thankful because I've got I love my husband and my wonderful kids so much and everything's amazing. And then the British ones would be like, I'm waiting for a bus in the rain and it's rubbish, but as time has gone on, it's almost become this kind of global tone of happiness, that everybody on Facebook or Instagram is just pushing across this message of being completely blissfully happy at all times. And I don't think it's healthy. I think you look at that, and there's studies that show that people actually become miserable from looking at social media, because for this very reason, that you look at everybody else's edited highlights and you feel pretty inadequate about your own life and your own happiness. And as you say, were people, I think there's a balance, you don't want the whole thing to be just a complete stream of complaints, but at the same time, I quite like a bit of emotional honesty on there.
Yeah. I mean, it comes down to the way it receives. It's almost like gratitude shaming. And
right.
It's like, look, there's no way you could ever feel as great. I mean, it becomes a competitive game like everything in America. All the spiritual teachings, what came over from the East in the 50s and the 60s, they all took on a competitive tone that they didn't have in the land where they generated from. But here in America, we have to make everything a competitive game. So now mindfulness becomes a game. How mindful can, my grandfather used to just say, pay attention. But that was a $1 billion industry called paying attention. It was just kind of wisdom that your grandfather would give you. Say, just pay attention. It's a good thing to do, But now, all this, as long as it can be commodified, as long as it can be turned into a game, as long as people could try to, compete and to show. I mean, look at yoga classes in America. I mean, we started doing yoga in our house in the mid-'60s. So I was around it when it was a real, it was a, we'll say back to the countercultural experience. Now it's a big fashion experience with expensive yoga pants. And you go to Target, there's a whole yoga section in Target. And everything is about the individual promoting themselves. It's all about how we promote ourselves, and now on social media, how we do it and shame you into showing how much better we are at being mindful, how much better I am at being grateful. And again, like you say, it just makes people miserable.
Yeah, and I think that can easily become kind of a stick to beat people with. And I remember in the book I interviewed this woman she's a woman named Linda Tirado, who's written an excellent book called Hand to Mouth, Getting By in Bootstrap America, about her experiences of living in poverty in America, or being poor. And she said that she would be in some terrible job, working in a fast food restaurant or whatever, and they would just be telling her that what she really needed to do was to be more mindful or more positive or more grateful. And it becomes a stick to beat people with. So every time people say, actually, I need a pay rise, the automatic response will be, well, why not practice gratitude for what you have? And it's very anti-change, isn't it? I mean, it's very anti, social justice and actually doing anything about it. I mean, if everyone's supposed to be feeling so grateful all the time, then, the civil rights movement never would have happened, the feminist movement never would have happened. You do not get change from being grateful.
Yeah. So in the end, so what's left for people to do? I mean, what is your... I don't know if you leave people with a message at the end of the book, is how do people really kind of find the sense of contentment? I mean, because to me, happiness is so amorphous anyway. What does it really mean? But when you suggested before about people get more out of doing for others than doing for themselves.
Absolutely.
And can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, research shows very, very strongly that the single biggest factor affecting our happiness and our well-being is our social relationships and our communities, and that's kind of on a micro and a macro level. So it's, how much time I spend literally talking to my family, socializing with my friends, seeing my neighbors, that kind of thing. And also on a wider level, how countries where people feel more invested in the wider community with stronger social welfare systems, stronger social safety nets, rank as happier than countries without them generally. And so that's part of the same narrative, which is all about buying into a wider sense of social responsibility. So, but if it's just a case of, how me as an individual can become happier, then absolutely spending time investing in your relationships, that's the biggest thing that you can do to make yourself happy.
and relationships. You're not just talking about your family and your friends. I mean, because to Americans, I think the American sense of relationship has been so distilled and watered down to, the idea of success in America is that you have your own place, and you have your own place means you live alone.
Yes.
So I think people in America are just lost on the idea of what a larger idea of a relationship is, even.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've got a real crisis, and it's true where, in the UK, where I'm from as well, that we have this kind of loneliness crisis. We live far from our families, we live far from our traditional kind of communities that we used to have. We spend less time socialising than we ever did. We spend less time inviting people over. There was some awful statistic I read the other day that said pretty much, I think it was half of all meals in America are eaten alone. How depressing is that? And so, yes, absolutely, it's our relationships, with our loved ones, our families, our friends, and also being part of a wider community, getting involved, in your neighbourhood, in your community, in your politics, in your country, all of those things are what promotes happiness.
Great. Well, that's been great. Thank you so much for your time. I'll make sure I link to your book and your articles, and maybe we could do this again sometime.
I'd appreciate that. Thanks so much. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.